Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Good evening to everyone in India. And of course, I see there are other time zones as well. Good morning, late morning, whatever that be. And I hope you had a good celebration. Those of you from India, this past few days. I know in some parts of India, the celebration goes on for 10, 11 days, like Maharashtra and so on. I also want to take a second to pay tribute, since today is September 11, to those who were intensely affected because of 9/11. So I'm glad to be part of this presentation again today, and welcome back to those of you who were already there for the other sessions. So just a little bit about myself. I am a social worker, and with respect to my background, I teach at a university, the social work program, and I also am a clinician, work part-time in a clinic. My training has all been in India, right up to my doctoral work, after which I moved out. Going on to talking about MAP INDEAR, we are mainly a group of voluntary professionals, including South Asian, non-South Asian mental health professionals, came together mainly because of what we are all experiencing with COVID, and all of us as first responders, in terms of doctors, psychologists, social workers, different professionals, where we have had to work towards, diffusing situations, working through stress for different people, people we work with, work for, and also having to take care of ourselves, our families. So this series of trainings have been mainly focused on, getting to know about de-escalation, getting to know about where things can escalate in these kind of stressful situations, and how to confront them, how to de-escalate, how to work with others, individuals, families, organizations, and also take care of ourselves. So coming to introduce our speaker for today, Ms. Deborah Horowitz. She is a clinician by background with a master's in social work. She's also a researcher and educator. She has more than 25 years of experience. Her focus has been to do with safety, with providing hope, healing, especially in traumatic situations, situations where things get difficult for individuals, families, communities, organizations. So as part of her being a trainer, she has created multiple curricula, training materials. She's also, and primarily now she works with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, providing training all over the state. Of course, her training and education also extends to different parts of the country, as she was talking today, other countries as well. And her research has included, again, her focus areas mainly to do with safety, violence at multiple levels. So she's published, she's worked with other researchers. And important is also her skill in leadership. So she has not only lived it, but also trained others in leadership. She's also a team builder, works great with teams and models it, as I have seen through associating with her in the last couple of months. So she's also, needless to say, she's won multiple awards in recognition of what she's done. So I'm happy to have her as part of these training series, and I'd like to welcome her to this. And before we begin, and before I hand it over to Deborah, I just would like to welcome you all, and I'd like you all to use the chat box to introduce yourselves, your background, and also use the chat box for any comments that you'd like to share, questions that you have. We will, have breaks in between. Deborah does that very well, where, she would pause for questions, any responses, or, and I think since we are a small group, maybe we could even, you could use the mic if you don't want to type on the chat box. We could use the mic for you to talk as well. So this can be a pretty informal session since we are a small, not too large a group. Okay, so over to you, Deborah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me this evening. I really appreciate you spending the time to learn about all of these skills and assessments. I would like to say again that some of the material we're going to cover today can be challenging, can bring up some feelings and emotions that we may not have dealt with. And so I have Nancy Sweeney here, who is willing to, if you need some additional support or want more of an explanation, she's also with her separately if needed. So let's begin. Wait a minute. To share my screen. Please let me know if you can see this.
Yeah, we can see this.
Great, wonderful. Here we are, part of INDEAR. I am so blessed to be a part of this program. It has been amazing in the way that it collaborates, and I hope it continues, and I hope to be a part of it going forward. Today's agenda, we're really going to take a look at these behaviors that are very challenging. As Kala mentioned, there are times when we are seeing agitation and aggression, and what does that look like? How do we know that there's a threat? Then we're going to talk about how we figure that out through Universal Behavioral Safety Precautions. These are the ways in which we understand that the dynamic involved in a challenging behavior. Session 4 is the real life de-escalation. Here it's the assessment in history and in the moment, and we will talk about that. We'll also talk about mob violence and how that develops and works. We have a lot of material today, so I'm hoping that in the time that we have, I can get through most of it. If for some reason we can't, we will try and get you additional materials or figure out an alternative. But I hope today you're taking away the knowledge that you need to know, because the more risk factors people display, the higher the likelihood that there'll be some kind of violence. Because we are complex beings, violence assessment is also complex. There is not one single factor that is only involved. Again, things don't happen in a vacuum, but we can identify all possible reasons or factors that might go into it. And to do that, session 2 and session 1 about the institutional, the structural, and the direct violence. So we really have to take a broad assessment lens, and that's what we're going to do today. And I love this little cartoon. All I said, Timson, was my door is always open. I never said anything about my mind. This is an opportunity for us to broaden our lens, take another look, dig a little deeper. So I just want you to think for a minute. When was it, think of a time someone was really, really angry with you. Can you tell me what that angry looked like? What was going on? What did it smell like, taste like? What was the physical sensation you had? So if you would either unmute and tell us or type it in the chat, that would be helpful. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to do that. I hope people are typing. Body stirs up things. Absolutely. Those are wonderful notions that you have and have experienced, because you're going to need to know what those feelings are in yourself in the moment and in order to do this assessment. And so again, I'm going to say that taking care of oneself and calming the part of the brain that is reptilian and limbic is extremely important. So mindfulness, oh, a kind of brain parking, oh, beautiful, beautiful. Automatic pilot, yes, yes, yes. So heartbeat increases, you got it, everything. So when somebody is angry, it's not only a feeling state, it's a body state, it's a physiological reaction. And as we pay attention to the signs of that, we do a better process of assessment. Oh, you're wonderful. Perfect. Oops. There we go. So when we think about challenging behaviors, we think about what's coming at us. And mostly we think about yelling and verbal abuse and foul language. I want to say something about that. These kinds of things where you are yelled at or threatened verbally are what we are rehearsal commitments for violence. Please take them seriously. It is very important that you understand that when people say something like that, it is one step further towards acting on it. And so oftentimes, because of the situations we're in, we may not be really addressing that, and then it becomes too late. You may see people have property destruction. People can get extremely primitive when they are so angry. They can default to their most basic action. And so you may see people who spit or bite. When we put people in restraint, 5-point restraint, that is the one time we're most likely to get bitten because they have no other alternative. Assault, the actual physical assault, bullying is huge and often ignored. We think about it sometimes just for children, but I will tell you it happens in interpersonal relationships, intimate partner abuse. It happens in the workplace between supervisors and supervisees and between other staff members. When people begin to view excessively violent media over and over and over again, that is a risk. If we begin to see people who are harming themselves, either through self-inflicted violence or suicide, we have to pay attention to that. What I'm going to say about that is just because someone is suicidal and has violence toward themselves does not preclude that they can be violent towards you. If they are courageous enough to override their self-preservation instinct to hurt themselves, they will have no problem hurting you. And people who do not take their medications and so have altered mental status states. We also see, particularly for staff, this kind of stalking behavior, healthcare workers, lots of calls, excessive calls, unwanted physical contact, inappropriate sexualized behavior. These are things that we see in the workplace that often go unaddressed, are, quote, invisible to leadership, and must be addressed because all of these are signs that it could escalate into something really significant. So factors that contribute to challenging behaviors, first of all, people are using behaviors because they need to have a need met, a need, a want, a wish, or desire. And so if those things are not met, you will see that the person ups the ante to try and get the attention of you because they have a need that is not met. Individuals who have a history of disrupted attachments, those who may be separated from families, had to be incarcerated, or are death and divorce. So there are social factors that contribute to this potential. Head trauma, we do know that traumatic brain injury has a big impact on the brain in the way that affect is regulated and the way that cognition happens. So people with TBI have often less impulse and less affect control than others. Hallucinations and delusions are a part of it. The obsession with perceived injustices I have bolded, because when people think they have been treated unfairly or unjustly, they have a compensatory response to try and even the playing field, to make it right. They can either make it right in a very proactive way, or they can try and make it right with an escalation and an intimidation. I am going to talk a little bit about the paranoia and the substance abuse, because substance abuse does play a significant role in behaviors. So I will say that in 1/3 of the suicide attempts, there is some kind of alcohol involved. Not to the point of complete intoxication, but to lower the inhibition so that the person can actually engage in the act. We also have medical issues. We do know that physical and psychic pain will override people's moral codes. They will do things that they might not otherwise do when they are in significant pain. And oftentimes this is where you will see the lashing out in the moment. People who have constant disappointment and don't get their needs met also have a high potential. I bolded boredom and perception that the worker is inexperienced and unprotected, because those are two very important keys. If people have been traumatized repeatedly and are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and then all of that chaos stops, that is so uncomfortable for that person that they will create a situation that will recreate all of the chaos. So boredom is a high risk. When are people bored? When they're waiting to see somebody for hours and hours and hours. So that perception of time is what we need to address there. The perception that the worker is inexperienced and unprotected. If somebody is going to target you, they're going to see how available you are, right? How fast can I get to you? How aware of your surroundings are you? And then how accessible are weapons? So if the worker is new and unprotected or working alone, and is it safe for a junior physician, there are certain skills that are needed in order to offset that potential. So the environment that you're in has quite a bit to do with the stimulation. People have different levels of tolerance for social, for sensory input, right? So as an only child, having a roommate was a terrible experience for me. Too much input, too much sensory, too much movement. We're going to talk about in the next session, again, how to ask the how or what rather than the why questions. And it's also, our cultural beliefs, our value systems, and people who are severely isolated in rural areas in particular, without access to people, are also at risk. So here's what we're doing. We're looking at the social ecological model. We're going to look at what happens in the individual. We're going to look at what happens in ourselves, and we'll see how it grows outward. We're going to use the concepts too of trauma-informed universal precautions. This is where we understand that all of our people have some form of trauma, including our staff. The work that you do is challenging enough, but it also brings with it the added exposure. So we're going to use the way that we communicate. We're going to talk about self-care today. We want to consider what we need to address in pervasive crises. Here's what we're doing. We want to make an assessment in advance. So the assessment that we know in advance is built upon the relationships you've had with your person or patient, right? The things that you've been over time, things that you're assessing. And when we put them all together, then you are ready to figure out how you respond, which is session 4, to an actual event. So here's what you need to know. Now, you don't have to know all of this, right? You have to figure out which cluster of these things might be operating. So if you have a person who has previously exhibited an escalation or some kind of challenging behavior towards you, you want to know what it is. What was it the last time, right? Because that could be coming at you again. You also want to know, when did some of these behaviors start, if you know, if you're taking a history. Because you want to know when it first developed. Is it pervasive and stable over time, or was it one time? So for example, a child who plays with matches at age 3 and starts a fire is very different from a child who does that at 3, does it again at 5 and lights his teddy bear on fire, does it again at 15, lights the bed on fire. Those two are very different in assessment, okay? You also want to know what was the most recent and what was the closest they came to being violent. Often the closest thing that comes to being violent is property destruction. So you'll see that. We do have to talk about substance use because it has an incredible effect on people's presentations. Intoxication and withdrawal from these medications definitely alters affective control. So if we're looking at people who take cocaine, cocaine medicates depression. When people are not feeling well, they may take cocaine because it increases and enhances their mood. They get very revved up, they're very able to accomplish things, they're able to focus, and that helps the depression. So when you withdraw from cocaine, you can expect to see someone who is extremely depressed. Alcohol medicates anxiety. It is a depressant, so we need to also remember that if you're giving somebody an antidepressant and they drink, that just wipes the whole thing out. When people are coming off of alcohol, which is an extremely serious detoxification process, they will present with an extremely anxious presentation to you. And for opiates, things like morphine, heroin, fentanyl, etc. Opiates medicate rage. When people are taking opiates, they have a great feeling of well-being and peace. People who are coming off of opiates are extremely angry. We will see this when somebody who overdoses and we give them Narcan and they immediately go into withdrawal. The presentation you're going to get is angry and rageful. And so you need to know if there is some kind of substance abuse history. Here is what your substance abuse history looks like in India. So you see that there's a predominance of alcohol, and then there's marijuana and the opioids. The others are not as prominent here. But it's important to know that you do have a significant problem. Now, when you have to know the individual, you have to know, do they have a trauma history, right? Have they had those damaged attachments? Do they exhibit to you sort of very poor boundaries, meaning that they're either too rigid and they lock everybody out and they shut down, or do they take everything in and everything is personal? It's really important that we understand our boundary styles and that we understand them for our people, and they are culturally bound. So there are differences in levels of boundaries between what happens in the US and what happens in India or other cultures. And so all of that is in the larger context. There are criminal behaviors that are incredible warning signs. Again, fire setting repeatedly, animal cruelty. If one person can inflict suffering on an animal, it is very easy to transfer that to actual humans. And any kind of armed attack where the goal is that somebody witnesses it. So here we have things like home invasions. Now we have the very small piece of violence being related to mental health symptoms, because all of these other things are human systems. Given the right set of circumstances, any one of us could be violent. And we often excuse violence as a mental illness, and it is anything but. So there are very few diagnostic criteria that are potentials for violence. Conduct disorder as a child, not being able to follow rules. Narcissistic personality disorder, we often see in intimate partner abuse, because the person who is perpetrating that abuse has a very shaky sense of self and needs constant reassurance because they feel less than. and it comes across as very entitled. I don't want you, I want the best. I need to talk to the most senior person. Often what happens in domestic violence, particularly when the person tries, the victim tries to leave that situation, that's the highest risk time, because that's when we often see murder suicides. And so when people are leaving domestic violence and intimate partner situations, they need safety plans and support to mitigate the risk. And there are very different safety plans available. Borderline personality disorder, because their sense of self is directly related to attachment, anytime they may feel abandoned or perceive that you are leaving, you can get a very angry, very rageful presentation. And the last one is psychopath versus sociopath. Oh, we have a lot of people who are incarcerated and they have exhibited antisocial behaviors. They've invaded the norms, etc. But psychopaths are about 20%, maybe less, of our incarcerated population. And here, what is important is that they have no empathy, right? They lose respect. They can lie very easily. They're very glib. They're very charming on the surface. But what is going on here is that the psychopath views you as a means to an end. And if you're seen as an object, there is no reason and no compunction not to do with you what they wish. So those are very rare in the larger scheme of things. We do see also narcissistic personality disorder when we see workplace that as well. Okay, you want to know what the history is. You take histories all the time, right? You take a medical history. This is a way for you to take a mental health inventory, because if there's a psychosis, if they're attending to some kind of internal stimuli, if they're hearing voices that tell them to hurt someone else, that's really important. If people are in the manic phase of a bipolar illness, that is also a high risk time, because what they are believing is nothing will happen to me. So even if I jump off this bridge, I will fly and you will sink. So there is a very high risk there. Let's talk about sleep deprivation. This is really, really important. Any one of us without sleep for 36 hours can hallucinate. Absolutely. Our judgment then becomes, if we're driving, as if we were intoxicated, and we have a high risk for accidents. And so we have to think about that in the way that we're treating and training our medical staff, our residents and interns. If people are starting and stopping meds, once we give people a medication, the brain stops making that chemical for itself. And when people just randomly stop taking it, not only are they not at the baseline, they have an extreme deficit. So therefore you see the real depression, the real anxiety, the rebound effect. And if people have been recently discharged from a relatively controlled setting, as if they were in the hospital or in a psychiatric unit or incarcerated, the recent discharge time is a huge risk, because they want to get back at the person that put them there. And age and gender matters. We do know that men ages 18 to 24 have the highest risk. And then there's mob violence. And part of it is because where individuals are in networks that promote violence as a problem-solving strategy. Violence is extremely effective in the short term, but in the long term, it damages all of the infrastructure that makes connection possible. So that's one of the things that we have to address. People who are drawn to these kinds of groups often feel very lonely, feel disconnected from family, feel disconnected from larger cultural things, and they may then join with others who also feel disenfranchised. And we do see this at the direct violence level. This is also structural in that if groups are fighting one another, small groups are fighting one another, they're not paying attention to the larger structure or the ideology that set all of this in motion. Do they have access to weapons? In mob violence, you usually see weapons of opportunity, rocks, bricks, metal that's on the floor, scraps. You begin to see people picking things up. So if you happen to see a large group start to pick things up, that's a signal to you that you need to get out of that area. You also want to know who gets targeted. There's something very different between targeting multiple people versus targeting one individual over and over and over again, as in intimate partner abuse. So when does this crowd become a mob? And first of all, why do we use the term mob? Because it has this really pejorative terminology attached to it. And often those in power will turn around and call people who are engaged in this like the herd, the masses, the lower classes, the miscreants, the goons. That's a way in which they can justify and legitimize their ideology. And so then they use the term to dismiss the action that people are trying to do. Even if it's a peaceful protest, they begin to dismiss it, people who are in power. And that really denies the voice. And so the more the voice is denied as the group, the higher the likelihood that they will react and push back because they are feeling treated unjustly, unfairly, and diminished. So characteristics of a mob are a large crowd that becomes sort of disorderly and bent on riotous or self-destruction. We also have crowds of people who are peacefully protesting, that it does not become this. And that's an important piece because the more people identify with the cause of that there's a reason to come together, there's less likelihood of violence towards you than a random attack. The random attack often ignites with little planning. One person loses affective control. And we do know from the last session that violence is contagious. And exactly that whole process that we went through in the last session ignites one another after another. They get infected with the violence. So you may find that you do sometimes have an instigator who may be antisocial, who may be the head of a gang or a corrupt organization, but you also have people who are extremely persuasive and glib and can speak the language. I often describe those that can do this as they know the words to say, but they lack the music behind it. They don't have the feeling behind it. So groups can rally around a specific cause. What we've seen in India with the mob violence against doctors is that one of the family members may lose affective control, but all of the people around them who have already lost people identify with the frustration of that one person, and so rally around that as a cause, and then you see the mob happening. They feel they have nothing left to lose. As we saw in the previous slide, if leadership diminishes and does not provide an official way to resolve conflict, then people feel as if they have nothing left to lose and they band together. We also want to know that these groups are not all the same within each other. There are multiple actions happening in a mob. It isn't just the attack on the person, the doctor at the moment. It's also an attack on people who may be trying to help. And so often we will see people who are frozen in place, and it is not that they do not know that there is something happening and they don't care. What they are concerned about is that they will again be seen as the focus. So part of safety planning with your group is talking about that. And there's some things with structure and organization, planning. So we do see some events that are planned. So if those individuals collectively have suffered multiple losses, and as you can see here, there are so many, I can't even get through the whole list. But here we have in a pandemic, the potential for all of these losses and a crisis in which we are sitting with so much uncertainty against a threat we cannot see, which our brain is on high alert for. So we are much more sensitive to personal losses right now than we might otherwise be. And so the individual who is looking to do this attack has reasons for doing it. Are they feeling that they are losing their freedom? Partner abuse. Do they feel that they have no self-esteem, which is part of narcissistic and borderline personality disorder? Are they doing it to feel secure? Are they doing it as a way to make sure that things run their way? We see this in organizations a lot. And then, I have to minimize for a moment there. Are they really sensitive to criticism? With narcissistic personality disorder, they are extremely sensitive to slights, even those that are perceived and not objective. And do people use medication or other substances? And are they feeling vulnerable because they don't have access to those substances, which we will see often in the withdrawal phase? So motivations are these, right? Acceptance. We see peers doing this, right? This is the gang violence as a means to discharge angry feelings, to bond around despair, to try and overthrow those in power. Some do it for the thrill. This is the psychopathology and the sociopaths. Are they doing it for revenge or jealousy? Also extremely prominent in intimate partner abuse. And if they engage in this behavior, is it rewarded? Do they get a higher level of social status? Here's what is about shame. Shame, hold on one second. Shame is the most powerful master emotion. It is the fear that we are not good enough. When we feel that not good enough, when we feel, oops,
Ms. Deborah, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so let me back up. So shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear that we're not good enough. And so this notion of shame, humiliation, rejection, and ridicule are primary. This is what you are looking for the most in a person. If you have stepped on that button, or if you are perceived as stepping on that button, and these are the feelings that are coming up, that is a time of high risk for you. And so motivational factors for the group are all of those feelings of unjust treatment, of being humiliated. They go together, and people find other people who feel that disenfranchised. And then they get together and they discharge their anger outward as a group. They may start to blame, as we've seen in protests where groups are asking and demanding that the leaders step down. If there's violence in service of a cause, I know today is the history of 9/11. Violence, that was violence in service of a cause. This is also war. This is also genocide. This is where people are sanctioned and allowed and encouraged to engage in violence. And sometimes it's about their survival. They have been attacked, and so now they are grouping together to prevent even further attacks. When these attacks happen, it is not that individuals lose their sense of identity, but rather it gets transferred to the group so that individual isn't carrying it all by themselves. So it becomes a way to displace and discharge energy. We did an entire standalone session on knowing your environment. So I'm going to just go through this sort of briefly. That situational awareness that you need to have. How aware are you of how fast can they get to you, and who's there that might rescue you? And then how accessible is a weapon? Is there a weapon available? So if you have all three of those, that is, and you are addressing them, you become less of what we call a soft and where they lead to, because an exit that leads out to a back alley where there's no other place to go is not the exit you want. You need to recognize that what you might be wearing could be used against you, your clothing as a weapon. And also the temperature, the noise, the lighting, the crowding, and the wait times. I did see some videos, absolutely, where people are compacted, sitting in stairwells for hours, so close to people, and it's very hot, and there's not a lot of water. Those are higher risk times. And so the more we could mitigate that piece, the less likely you are then to be a target. Here we are. You got to know yourself. You have to understand, because knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. When I started out in this field, I did my classical training. I felt armed and ready to go. Whenever I would see a new client, I would read everything about them, and then I would go, wasn't at all what I saw in the record. And then I had to learn in the moment what was needed. So you need to be aware of your own comfort level. Some people are not prepared to be in challenging environments. And how can we give them the skills if there is really something that they want to do? But we also have to understand people's different responses. Maintaining our own personal space and appropriate boundaries. This is really important for providers to articulate out loud. If somebody is coming too close to you, you can say something to the effect, I really would like to help you, but I need you to step back for a bit. Or I'm happy to help you, but I can't hear you when you're yelling at me. And oftentimes that is a way that you're maintaining and stating to them that you have a boundary that isn't crossed. And so that's really important that you're able to say that. Some people are not comfortable with the time of day they do the work. I know it's evening over there. It's about 8:48 over here. If I were training at 10 o'clock at night, this would not be a good training. My brain shuts off at 9. So you really have to know, are you a day person, a second shift person? You also have to make sure that you're getting enough sleep, because if you are deprived, you're not going to be able to perceive things correctly. And then how comfortable are you? Have you had enough training? Have you had enough practice? Many organizations have not even done a 10 of what's needed in order for our staff to be safer. So if you yourself have a personal experience, which is very activating for you, you have to understand that that could be triggered in you. You could go into a situation where you yourself are activated, which is why that mindfulness practice, that opportunity to take a moment to get our front neocortex back online is really important. We have to understand, what are our own values and beliefs about violence? If we believe that violence is justified at times, then we might be transmitting that, right? Are you able to cope with your own fear, anxiety, and distress? Who do you talk to? Who do you turn to? Because what you are exposed to is extremely disheartening. Are you preoccupied with your own personal issues? We have lives. We're supposed to have lives. However, in our lives, we may be suffering something else that may then leak into what we're talking about with the person served. And if you are physically ill or currently injured or exhausted, we have mental health workers that do get assaulted on our inpatient units. And one of the things that they do in order to try and deal with the trauma themselves is to say, oh, no, I'm not going to go and get medically cleared. Oh, no, I don't have to leave. I'm going to finish my shift. Unfortunately, what that does is make the person who was targeted more of a target, because now they're seen as weak. And it increases the risk for other people to get injured trying to protect the individual that was targeted in the first place. So if you are ill, if you are injured, if you are exhausted, you must find a way to take care of yourself and to see if you can get some time off. We all need that. We can't serve from an empty vessel. And then, are we just complacent? Do we just understand that, violence happens and okay, because when we do that, when we get complacent and we deny that it's a possibility that we could get hurt, we have one step closer to being hurt. Because how you establish that rapport and that empathy is extremely important. We talked about in the last session that empathy can save your life. And then, do you know what you do in a crisis? I ask all my new hires, in a crisis, do you fight, flight, freeze, or appease? And people will tell you what their default is. And so I'm going to ask you, what do you do? Do you fight, flight, freeze, or appease? Please put it in the chat. Fight, right? Freeze, appease, freeze. Sometimes fight, yep. Freeze. Okay. Fight, yep. Absolutely. Now, if you're doing trauma-informed work and people are aware of what your default style is, you can use it to your advantage in a crisis. So if somebody knows that when a crisis happens, they themselves get activated to step in and solve a problem, those are the people that you call on. It may not be you to be the right person to de-escalate, because if you freeze, right, and the other person is activated, that interaction is going to be difficult. So if somebody freezes or shuts down, maybe they're the ones that are taking notes about what is happening and documenting it. And if you're flight and you need to leave and have somebody else who's in fight mode step in and activate, then maybe you're the one going for help, additional help. So knowing what you do in a crisis and knowing what your other team members do in a crisis is really important. If you are working alone, which I understand people do a lot, there has to be a mechanism for you to call someone else to let them know what's happening. So we have had case managers who go into homes and have had escalating events. And what they do is leave an open line on speed dial to the supervisor or to 911, whatever your emergency is. So it's often very helpful if you are working alone to have a mechanism too in your phone where your support network can track you in case there is something that happens. So we can talk a little bit about that. People get supervision all the time. It's usually about productivity or documentation or what's happening within the organization. Very little of it is trauma-informed, and trauma-informed supervision is absolutely critical. It is entirely different from regular supervision, and it is something that I do offer because it fits well with understanding the de-escalation, and it's one of the ways that organizations can get to a feeling of social safety. And some key components of this are that we do pay attention to our responders, our workers' mental health, right? So we're talking about activation, we're talking about self-care, we're talking about boundaries, we're putting safety on the agenda every single time we meet, so that we're looking at those dangerous and unsafe conditions and we are not complacent about them. We're looking at them constantly. And then somebody is there to give continuous feedback and fidelity to this model, right? Because it is so key to keeping everyone safe. We do want you to trust your gut instinct. Your body will never tell you there's a threat when there isn't one. And you will have those sensations. The pulse will rise, the breathing rate will go. People will feel this tightness in their chest. I feel it in my arms, right? And the hair on the back of your neck goes up. Please trust that, because your body's telling you there's a threat before your neocortex can tell you. And so we spend a lot of time talking ourselves out of this feeling. We really need to be paying much more attention to it. And as I was talking about, culture also is bound up in all of this, right? We talk about what happens to the individual, we talk about what happens with ourselves, but we also have to talk about what the rules and standards are that result in behavior and beliefs that the group as a whole considers unacceptable. So in India, you do have the caste system that is a boundary that is not to be crossed. And that has repercussions for all of the caste levels and how they have their economic lives, what they're able to do in personal growth, who they are allowed to marry, and how they deal with death and dying. So all of these things are culturally bound, and we cannot forget that. So in this larger socioeconomic model, we're looking at this larger cultural context. If people do not have access to services and have lost all of those things that we've just talked about, or they are experiencing prejudice. Remember the disparity between the Brahmins and the Dalit, right? Not seen versus seen. Who gets the oppression? That in and out group thinking, the racism, the classism, the sexism, the homophobia, the caste, these are all in place and weighing on people. So if you see a mob violence where it is someone of a perceived higher level being attacked, much of this is activating that as well. If there's a lack of cohesive group, these disenfranchised youth that don't feel connected to family, don't feel connected to social structures, and then our decline in social mores. We are now in a global economy, which does things in an instant. I can buy anything in one click. I can see what happens around the world instantly. And so we have developed generations of people who expect things to go quickly. And when things do not go quickly, they feel as if they ought to. So there's this unmet expectation, unrealistic expectation that everything is going to happen now. This is why it's so important when you're doing this work to let people know what to expect. I actually went to a doctor's office, and he had actually put up a sign that looked like it does when you go to the airport. And it says, you know, your doctor is on time, doctor's 15 minutes late, doctor will see you, or you need to reschedule. And it's posted. And that actually diffused so much tension because people knew what to expect. And that is not an expensive intervention. If people are constantly watching violence, they become disinhibited, they become habituated to seeing it, desensitized. And then are there all these other beliefs involved? Is there poverty? Are those critical needs of food, shelter, and clothing not being met? So these are the larger complex cultural issues that are all weighing down on what is happening between the individual and you. Oops, hold on. And these cultural factors that we're talking about are verbal, yes, language, but also nonverbal in terms of how much space, how far away you are, who you can touch, who you can't touch. It also affects the vision, the cultural permission. How much are you allowed to tell what's going on? There are some people over here where what happens in the home stays in the home and nobody ever gets to tell. And there are other homes where we're having a problem, we need to seek help. And those are very culture bound. Language barriers. I understand that there are multiple dialects in India. And so when you have multiple languages, it is sometimes difficult to interpret everything. The way that things are said is not often the way people hear them. And whether people seek help or refuse, and how people make decisions. In the news that I've seen, not only is the patient involved, but They have attendance. They have a lot of people, and decision-making may be a group. It may be the elder. It can vary. It may be the male, the head of the household. So there are different decision-making styles and also different approaches to completing tasks, because those tasks in India are culture-bound as well. So we're paying attention to those. And these cultural differences affect our feelings about health, well-being. Here we have individuals that are so impacted by racism. Let me give you an example. When we get a person who is a person of color that finally enters our system, often they are given the most significant diagnosis of schizophrenia. They're 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with that illness. Is it because it's more prevalent with people of color? No. By the time they get to us, because of the mistrust of the system, because of the disparities in access about how much help I can get, then by the time they come to us, they're in their most extreme presentation of the illness. But that does not mean that all people of color do that. That's a systemic piece about health, well-being. There, we also have different ideas about punishment, retribution, and justice. Do we incarcerate? Is there a death penalty? Are we burning or stoning someone for crossing a line? And this is very, very significant, because understanding the behaviors of individuals and their attitudes about seeking help, getting help, what help is expected is really important. I understand that doctors are held in extremely high esteem, but then they're on a pedestal. And as Uma has pointed out, the only way from there is down, to fall off. So healthcare providers have to present themselves differently to the people that they're serving. And that means undoing a lot of the behaviors that they have been taught and examining them and doing new ones. The good news is that that is entirely possible. And I've seen it done successfully, repeatedly. There are some violent risk tools that you can use. And we actually do have time to take a look at them. So I'm really pleased. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Can I jump in just for a sec? Because this
please.
really goes back to an earlier, we were talking about the fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms. And Harjinder had a very interesting question, which you may be addressing in future sessions, but is there a way to bounce out of the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism?
Absolutely, absolutely. Controlling your breathing is the on-off switch, and we'll practice it repeatedly. I'll give you many, many exercises. I can actually there's like progressive muscle relaxation, where you are tightening your muscles and then releasing them. And there are grounding techniques that you can do. And these will help bring you back to the present and will get you out of that fight, flight, freeze response. And I am definitely happy to share those. Any other questions? I'm going to pause here for a minute because we've just gone through an awful lot of material. And I just want people to be able to take a moment and think about any questions that they might have. That one about how to you yourself get out of the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism is beautiful. I will definitely address that, particularly in the next session where it's so vital before you're de-escalating someone else.
Yeah, please feel free to use the chat box or turn on your mic and talk.
There's so much to process here. And
I know.
I keep thinking about the January 6th insurrection and how much of this applies to that group.
Absolutely. It's very interesting that sometimes people think that mob violence is a unique experience. And actually, it is not unique. Violence is a very banal thing. Anyone can be violent given the right set of circumstances. It's just the way that it's displayed. And when people in powerful positions have not experienced or seen because of the invisibility factor for them, violence, when it finally touches them, they're surprised. But it has been happening with those who have been disenfranchised for quite some time.
Yeah, we can think of all these kind of mobs or, as you said, both peaceful and violent protests in different parts of the world, again, addressing injustices of different types.
Absolutely.
And certainly related to COVID, I know some of the smaller villages in the Yucatan Peninsula where I live had barricaded themselves and would not allow people to come in, particularly foreigners. One couple tried to return to a home that they owned, and the villagers gathered with sticks and would not let them come back to their house.
Yes, that is absolutely happening. And the fear of being somehow infected or contaminated, and that threat that they are perceiving has absolutely rallied around that. And we have seen that several times. Here we see it with people who are fighting over should you wear a mask or not wear a mask. And we're seeing that kind of aggressive interaction. Are people still with me? I just kind of want to know if you're still with me.
Deborah, can I make, it's just a general understanding of the whole concept. Can I just bring that up? So what I'm understanding is actually anger violence is a very primitive instinctual mechanism, again, a coping mechanism. So what I'm getting here is to be aware of it, the signs, just to look out for the signs, and then how we can then become an interventive means to it, at least what we can connect to, and then bring in these skills and tools to kind of diffuse it. It's the whole concept of it. This is the feel that I'm getting to.
You are getting it just as it is meant. Absolutely. You're making the assessment. You've got the background information. You're looking for all of the cues that could potentially be risk. And then when there is a situation, you've got the awareness of what's causing it, therefore what you present back and how you intervene with that presentation is part of the toolkit. Because oftentimes people are offering interventions at the wrong time in the wrong way because they don't understand what's motivating that individual.
Yeah, so then comes, sorry, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so the next question comes is please do recommend some ways where, yes, we are going through the lists and the details, and it's very informative, and yes, it's extensive knowledge as well, that how we can actually make it as a part and parcel of our lifestyle, where we can sharpen our skills to actually be be more sensitive to these cues.
Absolutely. So what I'm thinking as you say that is something like what we would call over here a cheat sheet. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's sort of like bullets of what to be aware of that you post in an area for yourself that you see frequently, so that you're repeatedly exposing yourself to what the things are that you're supposed to look for. And then when you see it coming at you, you pull out the right tool and respond in a way that meets what is present to you. So I'm happy to think about how to get that to people. If you're interested in that, please put it in a chat, because I might be able to create a document for you with these signs that you're looking for.
Okay, that would be wonderful, because what is coming to me is, discussing about certain things, and sometimes if it's a political issue or say something about belief system, religious, so it differs, and it there can be a conflict. And then all of a sudden, either I will become defensive or my friend is becoming defensive. So then, yes, we try to diffuse by just, not talking about it or something. But then there is this discomfort, and now it's like I'm like, what is coming to me is, can I handle it in a different way? That would be interesting. That's a curiosity and creativity is coming up to me, is what would be another way of that I can change in the way I approach to this, that I can understand and read my friend. Yeah, she's coming from here. Yeah, this is a cultural difference. And what can I say instead of, this is where it comes, is like going into a freeze mode.
Yep.
Rather than going into a freeze defensive mode, is there something that I can say that can, just flow instead of being a cut off?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I will, if you
One
are,
question, Deborah.
go ahead.
I don't know if you have time for this, or
Sure, tell me.
Swati says, can we reflect upon violence perpetrated by certain ideologies?
Okay. Are you talking about religious mob violence? Are we talking about terrorism? Because that is part of this, and that ideology. When ideology becomes embedded, and when that ideology about who matters and who doesn't is in place, when that is sanctioned by the people in power, one of the things that happens is that those who are given permission to perpetrate violence, as in war or terrorism, have to find a way to dehumanize the people that they are going to hurt. They have to do those individuals are an object, those individuals are less than me, my actions are justified, and I have the power base supporting all of that. So this is where you hear soldiers often referring to their the people that they're hurting, in very pejorative terms. With the Vietnam War and the Korean War, it was viewed with negativity and with very pejorative words. And that is a way in which the people in power diminish and then justify their actions as being right in what they're doing. So what they do is they amplify a perceived problem to justify dehumanizing a group and attacking them. That could be a whole other training that I could talk about, but I hope that answers some of the question.
Yes,
If it doesn't,
yes, it does, Deborah. Yeah.
thank you.
And I suppose this is the ground where structural violence and direct violence interact.
Exactly. You got it. Absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So we've got our last little bit here. I'm going to talk about some violence and risk assessment tools. I'm just introducing them to you. There are also ways in which to become more knowledgeable to be able to use this tool. But I want you to understand that there are things out there that you can use. So first, we are using this Brocet checklist. It targets 6 key factors, and it's designed to see what is happening in the moment. So you are looking for if somebody has a change in their behavior in any of these areas. If they become confused, if their mental state is altered. So for example, somebody who has a urinary tract infection and their mental status may change, they may become confused, and that leads to a fearful presentation and they lash out. If they become far more irritable and agitated, this is that revving up part of the cycle that we talked about. If suddenly they become really boisterous and loud. So to your question about that individual conversation where you're debating and then all of a sudden it becomes much more heated, that's what we're talking about. That there's a change in the way if people are getting defensive, if they start showing signs of being physically threatening, attacking objects, or verbally threatening. So we put these on a checklist, and the more of these that are exhibited, we are looking for a potential for violence. So we're interpreting them this way. You know, if you're unaware of the time, place, or person, that's very fearful, right? I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm doing. So they feel backed into a corner. The irritability, the boisterous, slams the door, shouts when talking. So that heated conversation that started out as a debate where somebody gets up and like, I've had enough of this, and walks out. And then those physically intense. The verbal interpretation of this is verbal attacks, name calling, and angry tone. Okay. When you are called specific words, for women, it's the B and the C words. I don't know if you know what those are, and it's the P words. It's slang. So when you are targeted with words that are debasing you to your biological sex or essence, you have become an object to them, and they can do with you what they want. When they are attacking objects, kicking and smashing or headbutting, you need to be very careful. If you are interacting with them and they are looking at you and then looking away toward an object and looking at you again and looking at that object, that is the object that will be coming at you. The other tool that we can use is HCR 20 version 3. This talks about levels up to psychopathology. It's a contemporary approach because it's about assessment in the moment. It is an active process, and it looks at all the risk. You know, we were just talking about how structural violence leads to the individual violence. It's looking at all the risk factors in a comprehensive way. What I want to make sure that people understand is that we do not predict violence. We can never predict it as a surety, because that says that it's absolutely going to happen and that we're wrong if it doesn't happen. Our assessment is wrong. We don't predict. Rather, we do risk assessment. We're noting the variables that lead to violence. And if violence doesn't happen, great, but it doesn't mean we didn't pay attention to the risk factors. And so I want to make that really, really clear. And I love this, I love this cartoon. Seriously, no one saw this coming about the crystal balls. We often are supposed to be or expected to be predictors of behavior. And we can't. What we can do is look at all of the factors and say, hey, this is a definite possibility. This structure follows, it looks at the historical picture which we just went through, right? We just talked all about the individual history and things impacting the individual. Then we'll talk about in session 4, the in the moment variables. What is happening when they are yelling at you, swearing at you, throwing things? And then what are some of the things that might predict risk in the future? Right? Because one of the biggest predictors of future behavior is past behavior. So if they've been previously violent, that's going to be a future risk. And so it rates all of these items and then talks about, well, what are we going to do with this? Right? How are people going to handle this? Oops. Sorry. Oops. I have to go back a moment. Okay, there we go. So in that place, we do scoring. So 0, there's item is not a risk factor at all. 1, they got close to doing something but didn't actually do it. And then 2, the item is definitely present. And then those are added up. And so in conclusion, really, a man is who is seeking to understand violence does not belong to any country, to any religion, to any political party or partial system. He is concerned with the right set of circumstances. And it does not matter that we tend to stigmatize those who use violence. All right, so we have completed session 3. I would really, really love to hear your thoughts on how this went, what you might want more information on. Please feel free to unmute and talk with me and Nancy and Kala about your feelings about what the information is presenting.
They will immediately start speaking.
What occurred to me is that we can do some work ahead of time on ourselves, and I think many people do, in terms of a regular yoga or meditation practice or some kind of spiritual practice that does allow us to tune into ourselves and to manage those fight, flight, or freeze or appease responses. I think doing something like that on a daily basis can be really useful.
Absolutely, Nancy. It takes practice so that when you need to call it up, it becomes like that muscle that is automatic. And so that is extremely important. And it's really important before you engage even further with someone that you are checking in with your body before you are dealing with anything else. I'm so glad people are enjoying it, that they thought it was informative. Please let us know more. Please unmute. I'm really interested in your experiences and how this is related to what you're doing.
I was reminded of today we are looking into social emotional learning with kids in schools, making them aware of their emotions and how to express them, especially the more difficult emotions like anger.
Mm-hmm.
And recently I attended a series of sessions organized by woman. It's a training for kids, preschool kids. It's known as Stories, Songs, and Stretches.
Oh, I love it.
And which that stretches included yoga. And so it's about, helping kids understand their emotions through stories, through songs, music, and also stretch as part of managing their emotions. And this is to prepare preschool kids for school, which can be very daunting. So
and I love it.
I think that applies to adults too. Yeah.
Those are wonderful. We should institute that as wellness programs in our organizations. It's skills that we're teaching kids that we need to practice as well. And I think that that's wonderful. And we will talk about sensory options a little bit, because I think when somebody is giving you a very fearful presentation, when they're very shut down, using a sensory modality is one of the best ways to change their perception. And it's very effective for you and for them. I used to have, and I made 32 weighted teddy bears for my daughter's bat mitzvah. And one of the things you have to do for a bat mitzvah is give something to charity. So after her bat mitzvah, we gave these 32 weighted sensory animals that I made to the psychiatric hospital.
Oh.
If you have one of these in your office when you're seeing people, it can even just be a weighted pillow or a throw blanket. You can change perception in an instant, and that's really, really helpful. And I can even talk about what are some of the things you should have in your office anyway that might mitigate it, because there are sensory things that will help even before anything gets started. Yes, we absolutely can be aware of negative emotions as adverse events, and particularly if we've been affected or impacted by things constantly inundated. We absolutely, and the thoughts, yes, we have to do some work on what is the self-talk we're giving ourselves. What is the meaning that we are attributing to this behavior?
Deborah, can I say something?
Please.
Okay, so I love what you're describing, and thank you so much for sharing. there's so many ways that we can become aware of our internal states that can be protective of us, and that's my main takeaway here too. Hold on, maybe there's somebody who's speaking. I don't know if it's possible to
Somebody's
mute
mic
that
is on.
individual.
His mic is on.
Yeah, I don't know, Terlochenji, if you can mute folks. So what the place where my mind went a little bit is that there's a lot of wellness strategies that are embedded in our cultural structures. You know, like yoga, spirituality, meditation. There's so many of these that people do. And alongside that, when you do wellness activities, there's also a big, you need the structures that are protective as well, like family, like community. And those are all part of our kind of cultural narratives, right? Yeah, like laughter yoga. So there are all these things. And then one of the things, having lived in the US, that I am very wary of is there's a lot of importing of these practices, and they get decontextualized. So they're taken out of the context within which they're done, right?
Agreed.
And then brought back and sent back to the parts of the world that are, you know, and it's very focused on the individual. It doesn't take into account the family and the context, the structures that are protective. And the challenges that happen with that is that you know, this is just my personal bias, and I know folks will laugh when I say this. I really think that people confuse mindfulness with dissociation a lot. And that is part of the flight, freeze, right?
Yep.
And so we have to be so wary of the practice that we're doing in terms of wellness as well, right? That we have to be paying attention to the fact that, you know, you have to pick and choose what you're hearing from the West, because it's then those wellness practices, like grounding strategies are amazing, that, you know, those are fantastic for really addressing the trauma response. But then we have these practices that we are told to do, which should be very good for us, but they don't take into account all the structures and the morality that is needed to be part of the practice that helps us. So I just wanted to make a point about that not all practices are created equal. So.
No, and I would agree with that, because the violence that they're experiencing is culture bound. So too is the remedy. And taking into account exactly what you're saying, the larger context of supports is also going to determine what will work for the individual. And so sometimes there is work that we do with not only individuals, but with the family, but with the larger community, because there is this tendency now to co-opt other people's practices, and then suddenly turn around and say, oh, look, this is new. So when things are offered, you really have to find what works for you, and in the context of where you are. So thank you for bringing up that. Somebody asked me about a session for routines. Yeah, this could be a possibility. I would have to talk closer with Uma and everybody else. So if we could just make a note of that, I think that would be helpful. Laughter yoga, I love it. I love it. That is the best physiological way to change your emotional state and discharge tension. Beautiful. And yeah, absolutely. Our teens are having a really difficult time. But the most difficult is actually, for my daughter who works with young kids, is the fact that we have a whole now generation of COVID children who have been at home, who have been with their parents all the time, and so are now having a really difficult time socializing in school. So we are seeing a lot of that. Actually. Does anybody else want to add anything, any thoughts, any questions, anything you would like more of? Please let me know before we conclude for the day. Did you enjoy the session, I hope?
Yeah, there have a lot of complimentary messages, Deborah, on the chat.
Wonderful. So I hope to see you all tomorrow morning.
Yes. So thank you, everyone. And thank you very much, Deborah, for, again, a very inspiring session. Lots of information, a lot of it to sink in. And yes, so same time tomorrow evening for people in India, and depending on your time zones. So looking forward to seeing you again. I'm just checking here for messages. There were some as I was talking. So it's a wonderful session. Looking forward to the next one. And so tomorrow's session will focus on de-escalation.
Yep. When you're facing it, what's coming at you, and the tool that you pull out is tomorrow. So I'm delightful. Thank you everyone for your time. I really appreciate it.
So Rijuta Khanna wants to have a few minutes with you, with Deborah and Nancy.
Okay. All right, so we will stay on.
Okay, she wanted to know what we'll be doing, what we missed yesterday. Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually we missed the session yesterday, right? So Dr.
No, you didn't miss it. Sorry.
I mean, we didn't miss it, but we were like, we informed.
Yes.
If there is a distance accordingly.
Tuesday
Tuesday at the same time, ma'am?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Hello.
much.
I'm here.
Thank you for checking.
Yeah. Hello. So
All
what?
right.
Yeah. So I just joined back. So when we decided the last session?
Tuesday,
Tuesday at same time.
same time. Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Is there any reference material for this session? In case there are some worksheets or reference material, you can email me.
I will send them to you. Yes. I will send
Okay.
them to you, and you can distribute them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Uma, Nancy, and Kala, do you want to touch base after?